Mr. Joyce, just in short, what is EPBD? I know it's impossible to say it in short, but let's try.
So the EPBD, Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, is a piece of EU law that requires member states to take action on their building stock to make it more energy performing and now more sustainable.
Why do you think EPBD is so relevant and why?
Because we spend 90% of our time in buildings. That's 90% of every single day, every single night. And the quality of those buildings is really important for our health and well-being. On top of that, the building sector represents the largest gross value added for all of our economies and consumes 40% of all energy that's produced in the EU, emitting at the same time 36% of our greenhouse gas. So unless we pay attention to our building stock, we are on a road to climate chaos and discomfort and ill health for everybody in the EU. And the Buildings Directive is a small stone in the dam to stop all of this happening.
What are the biggest novelties and how will they impact small people, especially those who are energy poor, regarding the EPBD?
Okay, there's two important parts to this question. So the European legislators have decided that they will try to introduce a requirement for all buildings to be renovated across the EU. In the directive, there's a target for all buildings to be zero-emission buildings by 2050. So this is the main novelty in the current directive. There are other detailed novelties that maybe your listeners aren't so keen on, but let me say that when adopted, there will be more financing instruments and more supportive conditions to help people to renovate. For what it will mean for people, that will depend on your member state, because your member state has to transpose the requirements of the directive into national law, and in doing so they will take account of your cultural, your socioeconomic conditions, and once they comply with the directive, they can decide precisely how this will affect people.
Why don't we have the definition of energy poor person in Europe?
That's
legal definition.
Yeah, it is now mentioned more and more frequently in EU legislation. The key reason why it's not defined at EU level is that energy poverty is considered a social issue, and social issues are not the competence of the European Union, they are the competence of each member state. So member states guard quite closely that kind of power to define who or who is not energy poor in their country. And in fact, some countries believe that they have no energy poor in their countries. Like? Something I think is not correct. Generally Scandinavian countries.
Okay, that's logic. Let's take a little step back. I'm talking about the examples from Croatia, but I think across Europe is the same thing. At least half of the building stock in Croatia is not energy efficient. I think that the situation is similar all across Europe, maybe not in the Scandinavian countries, but okay. How will we do the energy renovation across the Europe and make the buildings energy efficient and take the goal till 2050 zero emission? Half of the building stock is not energy efficient today, and it would take a lot of money to renovate all those buildings. How? Okay, EPBD is not the solution of that problem, of course, but it's, as you said, a little small step towards that. But as I remember, when we were in Bratislava, only 11% of total amount of capital that is needed to renovate the buildings will be provided by the EU funds. So how will we take the gap, and how will we restore all of our buildings?
So for people who are today wanting to renovate their buildings, my answer may not sound promising, because the way the directive envisages that this will happen is that member states will prepare what are called national building renovation plans, And those plans have got to contain all of the instruments that are needed to execute the plans. So it's not just a strategy. And those plans have got to describe the pathway for all buildings to reach that zero emission standard by 2050. So this will become a legal requirement on member states. On the financing side, it is very, very clear to us that indeed there isn't enough public funding. So we have to unlock public and private funding instruments moving forward. And I was at a conference yesterday in Brussels on energy poverty, and many of the speakers who are experts in the area said that they are not in support of always having 100% subsidies for every renovation project. It means that we have to mobilize the financing sector, and that work is underway. It has been underway, believe it or not, for 10 years with the Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group, a wonderful website with huge resources for anyone who's interested in digging deeper. And the 11% or so that we have from public funds can be used to leverage the private funds by putting into place guarantee funds, by underwriting risk, which by the way is much lower on energy financing, energy efficiency loans than on standard loans by about 50%. And I'm therefore optimistic that at least the structures can be put in place. Now, you may ask the question, but how do we manage it in a labor-constricted market? Because indeed, the question of skills and numbers of the workforce is arising all across Europe. And there, I think that the partners of the Renovate Europe campaign, an industry-led campaign, can do a lot because they can put in place training programs and can become more self-assertive about designing offers for the market. So I'm optimistic moving forward. I think in the renovation space, greater innovation is needed. And by this, I mean more digitalization, more off-site construction of modules that can be used for renovation. And I can't sit in Croatia and not mention another crucially important reason for renovating buildings, and that's seismic stability. Because when you have buildings that have been damaged by earthquakes that are still structurally sound, we must renovate them. So at that moment, we can do the energy renovation at what is in effect a lower cost, because it's an addition to a structural requirement that's being put in place.
Let's go from the Europe and Brussels to the small people living in buildings. Let's take an example. Imagine a building of 25 flats built in 1980s. How will EPBD affect the owners of that building, of that flats in the future?
So that will depend on what plans the member states put in place. So let me take the question differently. What do I hope it means for them? What I hope it means for them is that they will be given the means and the assistance to come together to take a collective decision to deep energy renovate their building. That when they come to do that, the works will be carried out to a very high quality by the best installers that are available on the market, and that at the end of the day, their energy bills will be cut by more than 60%, and that they will be happy. And these are the things that are possible with the directive, the way it's being designed. But I stress, it does depend on the quality of the planning that's undertaken at member state level, and that all across all the member states of the EU. But the directive opens the door for a brighter future. And I'm hoping that with our work to demonstrate best practice, to bring to the surface the good stories across Europe, that actually the people in your 25 apartment building will ask for the renovation, and they will come forward proactively. And then the governments and the local authorities and the city authorities will have to respond.
What will happen? Okay, EPBD is not in, still is in negotiations are undertaken and everything. So, but let's imagine what will happen if you said every national government has to have a plan, a strategy of energy renovation. That's okay, and every single member state has a goal that needs to be finished by 2030, 2035, 2050. What will happen if the member state doesn't achieve those goals?
So the first thing that will happen is the European Commission will engage with the member state with recommendations on how to improve the plans that they've put in place. Secondly, and that will be our job, we hope the stakeholders will raise their voice and say, you haven't done a good enough job here. This is not a realistic plan. We will not reach our targets. And here's how we can do it. And that the stakeholders, like the partners in the Renovate campaign, come forward with a counter proposal, the national partners in each country, in order to assist the member states to do the right thing. Now, I've also heard just yesterday that the Commission will go further than it has gone before, where it tended to just examine the content of plans and just say yes or no, you've complied with the requirements of the directive. This time around, they intend to not only issue recommendations, but to develop those recommendations by bringing regional member states together with stakeholders to together come up with recommendations that are then more likely to be taken into account by the member state. That means they'll be more proactive than they have been in the past. That's a good thing.
Will EPBD change the energy map of Europe?
Yes, it will.
How?
As I said at the start of our conversation, buildings are responsible for consuming 40% of the energy in the EU. The technologies we have today, the products, the equipment, the controls we have, allow us today to reduce that energy demand by 80%. So if we reduce by 80%, that's reducing the amount of energy needed to run our economies by 32%. That changes the energy map right away. The other way it can change the energy map is if we choose electrification as the way to decarbonize our building stock, which is the tendency at the moment through heat pumps and other equipment. Then we're going to impact on the energy grid, and those heat pumps and the new buildings of the future, the renovated buildings of the future, will be drawing on carbon-free sources. This is a requirement in the recast of the directive. Therefore, the energy map and where you send energy that's produced, say, from large wind farms will change. So if the buildings are renovated, yes, a better and changed energy map will emerge.
Next year is the super election year in Croatia, but also on EU level due to EU parliamentary elections. Do you expect that this topic of energy innovations of building will be on the political platforms for those politicians who will run the election campaigns? And maybe is there a risk of EPBD not be finished with the negotiations on the next this year, or it will be everything prolonged by at least a year?
Let me take your question backwards. So the chances of the directive being agreed this year are high, and we only hear positive words from the Parliament, from the European Council, from the Commission. And we will know that on the 7th, well, more likely the 8th of December, because the next political negotiations take place on the 7th. So if they are agreed on that day, then further technical meetings take place, translations take place, and there has to be a vote in the European Parliament and a vote in the European Council, the Council of the Member States. That means that if the negotiations are not successful on the 7th of December, then there is a small risk that it will not be adopted in time. If it's not adopted at that, if it's not agreed, sorry, at that point, then the next presidency, Belgium, will have 4 or 5 weeks to finish the negotiations, or else the clock beats them, because there's a certain time frame needed for the votes in the European Parliament. So that's the second part of your question. The first part of your question about the EU elections. If the directive is still in negotiation, I think then there's a higher chance that it will become an issue in the elections. And it has been politicized already by certain political tendencies, saying that the directive will negatively impact people's lives and their property rights. And that's false. It will not negatively impact their property rights, and it should positively impact the quality of their homes and offices. If the directive is agreed, then I don't expect it to become an issue for the elections. But in both cases, the Renovate Europe campaign and our partners will be seeking to find champions who will then champion the implementation of the directive in the new period, and who will champion the implementation in the right way moving forward so that it does not become an issue that's perceived negatively by building owners and by homeowners all across Europe. This directive is honestly intended to be a super positive directive for society, to put us firmly on the path towards a stable climate future, something that's at high risk today in Europe and across the globe. You know only too well in Croatia with the flooding you had last year, this summer in fact, in Croatia, which was quite disastrous, on top of the earthquakes suffered 3 or 4 years ago.
So your message for the politicians and for the voters next year is to not to politicize the energy solutions in Croatia and energy in Europe, energy innovation in Croatia, because it's a team that is above them and above us all.
Correct. I mean, we say it, this is an apolitical theme. This is not a theme for one political party or another, because it's good for everybody. Whatever your concern is, whether you're very strongly on the environmental side or very strongly on the business side, this is a very good directive for all. So we are putting out that message that this directive and the objectives of the directive for a high quality building stock sit above political infighting, political opinion and so on, because it's literally a societal project. It's good for everybody.
This is not your first time in Croatia. What is your opinion? How good is Croatia when it comes to renovation of buildings?
So I haven't had the chance, Tim, to travel around and have a look this trip, but I'm very aware that the Croatian government takes it very seriously, and they have been among the best students in several cases over the years. One case that I particularly think of, and I always use Croatia for that as that best practice example, is how you used energy performance contracting and ESCO's energy service companies for the renovation of your hospitals. You are one of the only countries in Europe that has succeeded in using this form of financing successfully. So Croatia understands the challenge. Now that you've had the terrible tragedy of the 2 earthquakes, you now have even more motivation. And now you will have a new tool that will allow your ministry and your government to put the best plans in place. And we will certainly stand with them and try and help them to do so.
Just to be clear, try to explain the ESCO thing, the ESCO model, because in I know you need several hours to explain it, but ESCO was the model that was a couple of years ago very successful. Then it's not because we didn't have the public tenders and everything, but in the last year or two, the ESCO model became popular again. You said we are one of the best practices in Europe. So when somebody says Croatia is best practices in Europe, try to explain how and why are we, because we are not used to. We are as Croatians are pretty critical when it takes it to us. So how are we the best practice in ESCO model in Europe?
You're the best practice because you've succeeded in using it and applying it to large public buildings successfully. And if I remember correctly, is it Karlovac is the hospital?
Karlovac, yes.
This hospital had, if I remember correctly, a 70% reduction in its energy demand after the ESCO model was applied to it. That's a huge success in anybody's terms. And despite the difficulty and the complexity, the legal complexity of using an ESCO model, whereby external funding is provided and the client does not pay up front for the works, but rather pays over a 10 or 12 year period on the basis of the saved energy. The fact that it worked here should encourage others to try the model. And there was a number of moments where there was a lot of legal interpretive work undertaken on things like the Stability Pact and on public debt rules, etc. But it was clarified by the European Union that this model is not subject to those rules. And you can spread the capital expenditure across a 10, 12, 15-year period and have it paid back by the client on the basis of the electricity bills. So I would encourage Croatia and other countries to continue to exploit this model for the benefit of the patients in hospitals, for children in schools, even in large residential schemes it's possible. I mean, I admit the ESCO model works best in large buildings or large energy using buildings, but it's one of a range of solutions that must be deployed across Europe.
Mr. Joyce, thank you very much for this conversation.
It's been a real pleasure, Tim. Thank you.